Hello everybody, welcome back to PS 113 Introduction to Psychology, Chapter 13, Therapies. In Part 1, I want to cover with you key concepts including the two broad types of therapies, the definition and assumptions of psychotherapy, and the very first brand of psychotherapy called psychodynamic therapy, also known as psychoanalysis. There are two broad types of therapy when helping people with psychological disorders, and they are biomedical therapies and psychotherapies. Biomedical approaches include medication, electroshock therapy, and psychosurgery. Psychotherapy, on the other hand, is defined as any approach that uses psychological rather than biological means to treat psychological disorders. Most often, this psychological approach involves talking in a relationship with a professional. In clinical practice, many people who suffer from anxiety, mood, and schizophrenic disorders receive a combination of both medicine and psychotherapy. That's the standard of care and that's standard of practice. Since this is a psychology course, we're going to spend the vast majority of our time on psychotherapy. And we will pay some attention to these biomedical approaches at the end of the chapter. The main assumption in psychotherapy is that your problem is not out there somewhere in the world or with people. The assumption is that the problem is within you. There's something about you that has to do with a lack of self-understanding into your thoughts, feelings, specific behaviors. But fear not, the good news is that you can gain self-understanding and insight into this and fix it. I recently read an article put out by the American Psychological Association, my professional group, that recognizes now over 1,000 different types of psychotherapy. Well, of course, I can't keep up with all of those, and I wouldn't expect you to. But it's been my observation that the vast majority of these are an offshoot or a combination or a hybrid of some of the basic schools of psychotherapy. I think that there's only about 6 or 7 basic forms of psychotherapy, and that will be good enough for us to cover and study in this chapter. I want to introduce each brand of psychotherapy and explain the assumptions of how the patient or client gets into trouble, and then the approach of the therapy on how they will help you to resume normal emotional and behavioral functioning in your life, how to get better. Each therapy has its own lingo and language. So here we go. The very first psychotherapist was Sigmund Freud. He is the most popular psychologist of all time and definitely one of the most influential. He got the ball rolling over 100 years ago when he discovered this talking cure after working with his patients. His pioneering approach is called psychodynamic therapy, but also known as psychoanalysis. We're going to spend a great deal of time on psychoanalysis because today it is still the foundation of all modern psychotherapy. The assumption in psychoanalysis is that people get in trouble because they have repressed childhood conflicts related to sexual and aggressive impulses and frustration around the psychosexual stages. However, these conflicts are unconscious. You're not immediately aware of this. Psychodynamic therapy, psychoanalysis, is best defined as the attempt to uncover these repressed childhood experiences that are thought to explain the patient's current difficulties. Then, once you gain an understanding of how these conflicts developed, you're free to change on your own. 3 major ideas are related to psychoanalysis, and these are free association, resistance, and transference. Free association is the cornerstone of psychoanalysis. The patient would come into the office, lay on the couch, and Freud would sit in a chair behind the patient's head. By the way, this is an iconic photo of Freud's consultation room later on after he moved to London, England, and this is the couch and his chair. He would then instruct the patient to say whatever came to mind, even if it seemed unrelated to the problem, and that he will piece together these associations and make an occasional interpretation. Freud believed that sooner or later the patient would access unconscious material that he could work with and in turn help the patient gain insight into the problem. Here's a question for you. Do you think that you, or anyone for that matter, could be totally uncensored, totally uninhibited in what you might say even to a therapist? Do you think there may be things that are too embarrassing or unpleasant to bring up? Well, of course. Everybody has to say of course to that. This is called resistance. Resistance is manifested when the patient becomes quiet, arrives late to therapy, even cancels the appointment, or gets there and says there's nothing to discuss. Freud knew that the patient was resisting. Perhaps the patient had thought of something at the end of the previous session that was upsetting, or is unconsciously trying to figure out how to express taboo thoughts and feelings. He had a wonderful expression, and it goes like this. When the lips are silent, excuse me, the fingertips chatter. And what he meant is that you can say there's nothing to talk about, but your body language will betray that fact. And Freud believed this was a critical stage to handle, as the patient might be on the verge of a therapeutic breakthrough. A third major idea is transference. Freud discovered that his patients would often project feelings originally directed at their parents towards him. And these feelings could range from sexual to aggressive, from mild to severe intensity, but they were always inappropriate to the situation in the here and now. This was another critical stage for the therapist to navigate, as he would point out to the patient that he or she does not have to react to him, Freud, or others in the way they previously reacted to their parents as a child in the past. Freud often saw his patients several times a week, for several months, or even several years. His patients got better. He was very useful to his patients, but therapy was very expensive and only available to the wealthy. Freud was born and raised and lived just about his entire life in Vienna, Austria, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the turn of the 20th century, and he served an upper-class population. Consequently, he saw relatively few patients in his career. Psychoanalysis is alive and well today, but it has evolved into a form different than what Freud practiced. It is much shorter and directive than 100 years ago. Well, that's all for now. So long. See you next time. Bye-bye.